Wow, what a fantastic appointment. Jay Bhattacharya has been nominated for the director post at the National Institutes of Health. And it's not only a fantastic appointment in itself, just based on his expertise, his honesty, his groundedness, his rationality, his sanity, all of those things. Just a fantastic guy. But perhaps even more so, and I think this was reflected in the reaction we saw online to his appointment, which was overwhelmingly positive, just extremely positive, probably the most out of any of these appointees that we've seen here over the past few weeks, is the redemption factor. That to me is just so beautiful. I mean, we'll talk here in a minute about what he might do and what he did do in the past and why this is such a great appointment in terms of the substance and content of what's going to happen. But just a redemption. This is the guy, Jay Bhattacharya, was censored by his soon-to-be predecessor, soon-to-be as in when he becomes the director, because the former director, Francis Collins, actually got Jay Bhattacharya censored on Twitter. He was blacklisted. His tweets were suppressed. We found that out through Elon Musk. Of course, the other thing is that Francis Collins, we got an email here a few years ago where he defamed Jay Bhattacharya in the most outrageous, horrible way. He called him a fringe epidemiologist. It was just absolutely sickening. So to have the former totally corrupt head be replaced by the guy whom he defamed is just beautiful.
It really is a special appointment. I mean, I can't think of an appointment that comes more full circle than this one in terms of the person who was, an outcast at NIH, despite being a preeminent, doctor and specialist. And we know, like you said, first of all, there was a censorship campaign that was kicked off against him when he was at Stanford to suppress him really before COVID even began. And then when COVID began, both Fauci and Collins collaborated together against this guy. So to have it come around full circle where the person who was basically ostracized and censored by the heads of NIH, who were wielding their power as an organization that financially controlled basically the scientific community, to then have Bhattacharya come back in and be the head of NIH, it is really something special. And there's the other aspect that not only do we have sort of that redemption factor, but we also have a person who's intimately involved with sort of all of the problems of NIH, both in terms of the cover-up. He's fully knowledgeable about everything that Fauci did and the kind of cover-ups that they were trying to organize. Heck, he was fighting against that with the Barrington Declaration. He knew what had transpired, but also somebody who understands the way the NIH wields their financial power and utilizes their incredible, vast budget where they can declare 36 billion in grants annually to the scientific community, whereby they've been the ones that have polluted the scientific community with the money and their control over those purse strings. So this is, I like you said, this is a wonderful appointment, and I think it's just universally applauded for all the right reasons.
Exactly. I mean, it's a $60 billion behemoth. You wonder where the remaining 24 billion go if only 36 go to so-called research, right? But leaving that aside, what we found out during COVID, and this had been going on for 30, 40 years, but we just unfortunately really didn't have an eye on it. I mean, collectively. You and I, obviously, but everyone else as well. I think, including President Trump and his team, and in term one, because they kept on all these people. When Trump came in on January 20th, 2017, he did not replace the totally corrupt NIH boss, Francis Collins. He did not replace the totally corrupt NIAID boss, Anthony Fauci. They all kept their jobs, from Obama and from earlier, Bush and so on. In fact, Fauci had been there for 40 years as head of NIAID. By the way, NIAID is sort of a subgroup within NIH. But if you look at the emails and if you look at how things were really run there, Fauci was the de facto boss. So even though Francis Collins was nominally Fauci's boss, it was really the other way around when you look at their communications in all these FOIA emails that we received. But coming back to your point about really controlling the research, controlling the narrative, it's astonishing how much these two guys micromanaged pretty much everything. And you see that in those emails. You think, oh, this is this ginormous institution and everything kind of runs on automated, in some automated way. And you've got program officers and this and this and this. Well, no, those guys were really running things on a micromanaged level, including, for instance, the outsourcing these gain of function experiments to Wuhan that got us the pandemic. But let's rewind maybe here for a moment and just kind of see how we got to Jay Bhattacharya being the new head of NIH. So I got to admit, I did not know who Jay Bhattacharya was until March, April of 2020. So he was a professor in Stanford, a very esteemed professor, very eminent, but it was just not my wheelhouse, and I just hadn't heard of him. What he did when the pandemic started, I think, is crucially important in understanding why we're all so happy. Everyone in this in the NIH and the public health establishment and so on, Fauci and Deborah Birx and all these characters, they all just made stuff up. So they came up with this 15 days, which Birx later admitted was a hoax, that they just wanted to trick Trump into, doing that, and then they would just keep extending it. She writes that in her book. Fauci just made stuff up as he went along on basically everything. We're not even talking about origin of COVID. I mean, that's just outright corruption. But he made up the masks don't work, and then they do work, and this, and he just constantly made stuff up. Well, just one guy, Jay Bhattacharya, was there in the background in his office in Stanford thinking, why are they doing these lockdowns? Why are they telling us that about this high fatality rate without having any data? They don't know anything. No one knows anything. So he actually went out and did a seroprevalence experiment, which the people who get the 60 billion in government did not do, or if they did do it, they covered it up.
You didn't like the results, yeah.
Maybe because they didn't like the results. Anyway, so Jay Bhattacharya did that right off the bat in March of 2020. And lo and behold, seroprevalence is how many people have antibodies to a particular disease. So he went into the community in Santa Clara, out there where Stanford is, and just did tests, or got people to volunteer. And they got thousands of samples, and then they tested them, and they found that something like 4% of the community, this is very, very early, we're talking March of 2020, right, already had antibodies. That means they already had COVID. That's like 1 in 20. Well, why is that so important? Well, because at the time we were being told it's just very few people, but it's gonna kill all those people who have it. Well, if the group who has it is much bigger, much larger, then obviously the percentage of those who die is much smaller, and that's where Fauci kind of played with the numbers. So I mean, let's just say there's anyway. Maybe I'll start with the conclusion. So Bhattacharya's study, which again was right at the beginning, found that the estimate of community spread was 80 times understated by Fauci and NIH. Understated. So there were 80 times more, not 80 more, 80 times more people who had already had COVID in the community than what Fauci was saying. Well, that automatically leads to a massive distortion in the fatality rate. So instead of like 10% or 5% or whatever they were telling us, it was something like 0.3 or 0.2 or whatever, and then age adjusted, it was even less. So that's how Bhattacharya got on the map. And I think that's kind of forgotten among all these things. It's like, oh, he just rose because he became Trump's friend or whatever. This is all rubbish. He did the real science. He did actual science right when it should have been done. And he did it the correct way. And he found out that COVID isn't nearly as deadly, and certainly not for certain age groups as we were being told.
Well, also it touches on two other aspects. One, as you said, the mortality factor is much lower, but it also indicates that it was spread much further in the population at the time than people had any idea of it having done. And that plays into two areas. One, it plays into lockdowns, that lockdowns are effectively useless because the virus is already well out there in the wild, that lockdowns are not going to be effective. It also plays into the aspect that you and I have discussed a number of times, and that is the origination point of the virus. and that we kept moving it back. The more work we did, the further we kept moving the needle back as to when the virus escaped. And we may still move it again. Right now, I think we're probably in the June, July of 2019 timeframe. And if that's accurate, that plays in very, very well with it already being out into the community and having made its way already into the population of the United States, where a lot of people were ill and had no idea. They just thought it was probably an unusually, kind of vicious flu. Um, and it also just highlights the actions of Fauci. I still struggle to get past Fauci when he was out there in the early days of what they told us was the onset of the pandemic, and that he was saying that COVID wasn't a risk. It wasn't a big deal, that flu was the big risk. And at the same time, what was Fauci doing? Fauci was going and speaking with the CEO of Moderna to get the mRNA vaccines underway, mass production of, a vaccine that nobody really knew anything about. That was kind of how it began. And that's ultimately, I think that's where we got to Jay pushing back on this whole idea of clampdowns, of saying, look, my studies show that it's out there. The mortality rate is far lower than what everybody's saying, and it's already prevalent in the population. A lockdown isn't going to do anything. And that
Yeah, and
led to
also
his.
that's right. I just add the other one that I'm not an epidemiologist, and I don't. Back then, I certainly didn't know that much about this stuff. But there's one thing I did know as soon as I read Jay's study back in March, April 2020, and that was that the contact tracing, which Fauci was a huge fan of, and which, by the way, cost hundreds of billions if you add in costs, not just the actual doing it, but the cost to the economy, the opportunity cost, all that kind of stuff. Well, maybe tens of billions. I mean, someone can quantify that, but lockdowns obviously cost trillions, but
Trillions.
the contact tracing itself costs many, many, many billions. However many, maybe someone should look into how much that actually cost us. And that just struck me immediately as completely ridiculous, because once you think about it, 1 in 20 people in Santa Clara County have it or have had it. What's the point in doing contact tracing? Some guy on a bus has it. Oh, now you have to trace everyone on the bus and, send out armies of people trying to trace who was on that bus and where did they go and whom did they meet and where, absolutely ridiculous for a disease which at the outset, or the supposed outset, already like 5% had. And as you said earlier, the NIH is so corrupt, they didn't want to hear it, because whether they did their own study and knew this and covered it up or not, it doesn't even matter, because Jay Bhattacharya put out his study. I think he put it out in early April of 2020. So it was public at that point. And he was just dismissed as a fringe epidemiologist who doesn't know anything, even though that study was 100% the exact thing you ought to do in the circumstances. That's actual science.
Everything that Jay discussed and did and talked about and tried to push has been proven true with hindsight. He was 100% correct. Fauci was 100% wrong. Fauci was lying, trying to cover it up. And everything that he was talking about, including the Barrington Declaration, was accurate. There has been some distortion out there. I've seen people trying to throw around this figure of, what was it, 40,000 people, that Bhattacharya claimed that 40,000 people were going to die of COVID and that many more did, and therefore he was wrong. He never said that. Yet I'm seeing that quote widely being promoted by the left. So for those watching, he never said that. I think he was actually reasonably accurate in his estimates. But again, the larger point is that he recognized, his study showed that the virus was already out in the wild. It was already in the US population. And so all of these steps that we were taking were completely incorrect and unnecessary. They didn't accomplish anything, which is why he then moved towards creating the Great Barrington Declaration, which basically said, look, it's out there, and the best thing we can do is just to allow herd immunity, and that it's not that lethal. It doesn't have the lethality that everybody's pretending that it is. Meanwhile, what's going on with Fauci and the government, they're doing everything they can to distort death records. That basically anybody who died in some way, shape, or form got anointed as being a COVID death. And we had this massive inflation of the death records, which still I don't think we really have ever been able to completely sort out and disentangle. We just know that they're massively, massively inflated, as simply as a means to promote what they were trying to do. all of this also always calls back into question, what was Fauci doing with some of his early preparations for a pandemic, given that we now feel pretty confident that the start of the virus was before that. It places those things in a whole new light as well. But importantly, the good doctor knows all of this. You know, Bhattacharya has been through the entire. He's somebody who is aware with how the NIH works. He's somebody who's aware how the censorship complex works because he was part of it. It happened to him not only with the Great Barrington Declaration, but before that, as you were discussing with the study, and even before that, he was coming under some impact at Stanford and realizing how the universities had changed. So he's aware of all that, but he's also intimately involved with the funding process and the way that that's been distorted and how that's really twisted. Science isn't science anymore. Science is more like social science at this point. And he's aware of that aspect too. So, it's all of these reasons why we're so excited, why he's been the one who's been chosen here.
That's right. You touch upon this really important point that he doesn't only tick one box. By the way, when I say ticking, that's not a very nice way of putting it. How should we say? He's not only the perfect pick on one or two or three issues. He's the perfect pick on every single issue, and that it's just an absolute slam dunk. And of course, the other one we only touched upon briefly so far is the origin of COVID. So a lot of these public health people, when you look at the discussions, are very much into the lockdowns or anti-lockdown, as it may be. So there were a few, not many. Bhattacharya was, of course, one right there at the start when it was extremely unpopular and even dangerous for your, job security and so on to say anything. Well, he did. As you mentioned, he also was there at the center of this whole censorship complex because he was censored. I mean, the head of the NIH personally went out there and got Bhattacharya censored on Twitter and other social media. But it's also the origin, which in many ways is probably the biggest kind of elephant in the room that we're not supposed to talk about, because it goes to the culpability of people like Collins and Fauci for all these deaths, for causing the pandemic, for all these tens of trillions of wasted money. And to start off with, in terms of the origin, that original study, the original seroprevalence study that Bhattacharya did, is so crucial because if it burns through the population like that, it's been perfected for human transmission. So that's another thing we learned from that study. People sort of often don't know that there was not a single transmission, not one, of the original SARS virus in the United States. No one died in the United States. Anyone who had it brought it in, but it was very difficult to pass it on. Worldwide, 774 people died. I mean, it's always made out to be this gigantic thing that happened back in 2002, 2003, but it really wasn't. I mean, that's like a bad, plane crash or whatever, in terms of
it had
overall.
The potential to be really bad, but the key didn't fit very well.
Exactly. The key didn't fit. The people could get it if they were susceptible in some way, if a lot of bad circumstances kind of came together. But in terms of just seeing someone on the street and they got the original SARS, are you going to get it? Very, very unlikely. Because even if the thing gets into your body, it can't get into the cells because, as you just said, the key doesn't work. And the key is what was done at the Wuhan lab, where they swapped the key to make it work in humans. That was the whole thing they did. They took a coronavirus and added another key specifically so that it could infect humans. That was, in one sentence, is what these guys did. And the study that Bhattacharya did right at the outset, among all the other things we already discussed that he proved, he also proved that. So that goes straight to the heart of origin.
It always amazes me that you've got a fear and cleavage site present in the coronavirus where no fear and cleavage site has been present. And that's the thing that was the hallmark, like during Fauci's secret teleconference, his scientists were locking in on, how do you explain this? And well, the explanation is pretty simple, is it was genetically modified. It was placed there, and Bhattacharya knows all this. And again, he was ground zero at Stanford. Stanford was ground zero for censorship, not just on the campus, but censorship of Americans everywhere. You know, they were leading that charge. The
You know,
only thing we've talked about how many ways that he fits, you know, like does tick all the boxes, is the perfect guy. The only one area where I would say maybe I'm unsure is the fact that he's such a nice guy. He's both
good
of us
point.
have talked to him, you know, on DMs, etc. But you know, we've spoken to him. He's a fantastic. I mean, all of my impressions anyway is that he's just a fantastic guy, and that would maybe be my only possible concern. I hope that he is still angry for everything that was done to him. So, because this is such an important position because it extends beyond NIH. And just again to remind everybody, NIH, parent company, parent agency, below that NIAID. And that Fauci was at NIAID, but Fauci really ran the whole shebang. And that extends into other agencies, not just into the scientific community, but that extends into the Department of Defense. That extends into the intelligence community. We know that 15 different federal agencies were aware and had seen presentations on the diffuse proposal, which was the blueprint for COVID, and they did nothing. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this NIH position is potentially extremely important because it extends into, with tentacles, into the, you know, probably most aspects of our government. It wasn't just NIH that was running censorship efforts. It was the DoD, it was the intelligence community, it was the White House, you know, everybody working up in a responsive effort to the outbreak. So I do hope that he comes in and that he's angry enough to, you know, maybe take some of the hard steps that need to be taken.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. He is a genuinely, really, really nice person, the nicest
Mhm.
person you could ever wish to meet. And I mean, across the board, everyone says that. It's just one of those few people where, you know, other than the people who created COVID or brought us COVID, you know, the fraudsters, everyone says that. Just go on X, go on Twitter. You know, everyone who's met him, everyone who knows him is not only extremely happy about the appointment, but they all say what a wonderful, wonderful man he is. And I agree with you. That could be a bit of an Achilles heel. It doesn't have to be.
Doesn't
He
have.
could be a very
There's
nice
also
person.
there's an offset to that he just did a interview. You can, everybody can find it on YouTube, with Nicole Shanahan, RFK's campaign manager, along with Mike Benz and Eric Weinstein. And when you listen to Bhattacharya in that, it's clear that there is still some open wounds when he discusses some of this, especially when he was discussing the censorship effort. So, you know, you could go find that, but hopefully that carries over and that he's got some, you know, kind of real, I don't know what the right word is, driving anger, what, you know, whatever, to get to make some real changes.
Well, he's a
He's
very
certainly motivated.
he's super nice, but also very serious, a serious
Yeah.
person. The thing that's been so missing from the entire Biden administration, like an actually serious person. And yeah, I would probably look at the Missouri case, which is the case brought against Biden for the censorship, which Bhattacharya joined as a
Yeah.
litigant, um, as an example of nice but firm. Because if you're just nice, or if you're a squish or whatever, you're going to go, oh, well, I don't want any trouble. I got my little gig here at Stanford, a pretty big gig. You know, I got my tenure. I don't need to get involved. Oh, you know, leave me alone, whatever. He didn't do that. You know, he pursued it. He put his name into that lawsuit. So no, I think that this is all very good. It's going to be very interesting how the lawsuit pans out, because now you got the NIH director sort of in the government, but he's also suing the government, and you know, we'll kind of see how it all pans out. Obviously, I hope he's going to help us just unearth every single last document, because the NIH is the totally corrupt institution that is. Well, Fauci was in charge of NIAID, which we said earlier was kind of a de facto leader of the whole thing, and he's been in charge for 40 years. Other than a family business, when does it ever happen that an organization is led by the same person for 40 years? That's his empire. He built an empire, and you don't build empires unless you are extremely corrupt and, you know, do a lot of greasing all over the place. And that's what Fauci did, and he controlled that place, and he turned the whole place into a corrupt morass. It was just horrible, down to the program officers dealing, for instance, with Wuhan. One of the program officers flagged up back in 2016 that they were doing gain of function there and they were making these extremely dangerous coronaviruses. And he said, no, you can't do that. Well, Fauci immediately had that guy, silenced and overruled, and boom, we never heard about it again. In fact, we never heard about it at the time. We heard about it years and years later through some of these emails coming out. That's the level of micromanaging the corruption that Fauci and Colin, his boss, his nominal boss, Collins, were doing over there. The FOIA lady. This is a so-called bureaucrat whose only job is to get out these FOIA documents, runs the FOIA section. That's what they do, freedom of information. The FOIA lady is as corrupt as the others. We have these emails where she instructs or teaches other people within NIH how to avoid FOIA, how to keep things secret. This is the person in charge of getting it out, So that just shows you how completely corrupt the thing is from top to bottom. And yeah, I hope one of the first things that, he'll have a million things to do, and I don't envy him, for that, because he's going to take charge of a completely corrupt institution. And sometimes it's even easier, in my mind anyway, to just get rid of the whole thing and start over. But okay, that's probably not going to happen. So I hope he releases many, everything basically that has been hidden from us by the FOIA lady, by Fauci's senior advisor, David Morens, by Fauci himself, by Collins, and on and on and on.
Auchincloss.
Oh, Auchincloss. Yeah, you can sing a few songs about him, man.
Yeah, we'll have some more to come on Hugh Auchincloss in the future. In terms of the cover-up, those guys went so far as to misspelling words intentionally so that they wouldn't be found by a search function. This is the type of organization we were dealing with. They all knew what the gig was. They knew what the game was. And there's a reason for an organization as big as that it was controlled so tightly by Fauci, was the control of information. There's sort of three things that I guess I would really like to see out of this appointment. And by the way, I just want to clarify. Bhattacharya has proven again and again that he is willing to stand up to withering attacks. That is not the issue. I have no doubt about him having a steel backbone. What I just hope is that he's not too nice in terms of the forgiving sense. That's so just for clarity. But I would like to see, as you were just alluding to, the disclosure of all the documents. We kind of need open kimono on this whole thing. Even going back to when it started, how do we get to the mRNA vaccines and everything else? I would like to see the funding completely overhauled, which goes to your point about sometimes it's easier just to burn the whole thing down, because that controls the scientific community. And that's a big factor as to how we've gotten where we are now, with a polluted scientific community that's, seemingly caught up in anything but science. But lastly, what I would also like to see is disclosure over how some of the other diseases have arisen, and the fact that it's much more likely that some of the things that have hit our population over the decades are likely to have arisen from a lab leak than they are from a natural origin, which is how they've all been played out. Zika, whatever, you can pick it. You could all go all the way back to HIV and AIDS. How did that enter the population? And it was always that it had entered it naturally. And yet everything that you and I have looked at would indicate that that's actually very unlikely, and that a lab leak is far more likely for things like this. Ebola alone, and it also touches on the corruptness of NIH. It's almost certain that the Ebola outbreak of 2014 came out of a Kenema lab. Personally, I'm at 100%, but whatever, you can assign whatever probability, but it's very high. Fauci brought in the same people that ran tactics that were identical to the COVID cover-up for the Ebola outbreak. And he brought in those same people, Anderson and Gary, who were running the Kenema lab where the origination probably happened, brought in those same people to run the same playbook for COVID. So this is the kind of thing that we're facing, and the kind of dismantling that needs to be done. But I really would like to see some exposure and some light being shown on some of the past outbreaks, and whether or not, if indeed they did come out of a lab. It's my belief that most, if not all, did.
It's a very interesting point about, of course, Fauci bringing in these external people to run the cover-up on the COVID origin, which hasn't really been talked about. We put out an article on this a few weeks back, because it's just it's infuriating that we know that he brought in external people when he has internal people. Why? Why? Well, obviously, because he can control the external ones through the funding. Whereas the internal ones, well, they're civil servants. They get their, have well-paid jobs at NIH. There's not much that Fauci can do about them other than to censor them. And we put the article out. I mean, the reason we did at the time we did was because an email had come out of a guy called David Resnick, who's a highly paid scientist within NIH, within that organization, who was silenced. He wrote a study as to the lab leak early on. And he was silenced by the director's office, Francis Collins, at the time. His own, these are their own people. And so, as you say, they brought in external people because they can control them and because they can control the narrative. So here's an idea as well. When the new NIH kind of comes into being, one of the things that Bhattacharya and his team can do is they can try and seek out more of these kinds of stories like David Resnick. Go and talk to him. Ask him, how did that happen? Learn more about the toxic culture at NIH, which silenced this guy for 4 years until the FOIA emails came out. He's the one we found out because the emails happened to come out. There's probably like a dozen other ones who were silenced.
For every email we've seen, there's thousands we haven't.
We talked earlier, well, we didn't mention his name, Eric Stemme. He's the guy. He's just like a program officer who found out about the gain of function DASAC in Wuhan in 2016. Again, this is 4 years before the pandemic. He was like, no, stop the experiments. You can't do this. What exactly happened there? Well, we know that Fauci interceded, but we don't know the exact mechanism. We don't have, we haven't seen exactly what happened. Well, that needs to be uncovered. So I think what I'm trying to say basically is that within the organization, there's a lot of information there, which could very well lead to finding out. I mean, you could fix a lot just by going within, is what I'm trying to say. You don't even have to come in from the outside and just talk to the people in there and figure out what happened there. Find whistleblowers within. Maybe they're still scared of talking. That's how toxic things are. But I would go around and try and figure out who's been victimized within this organization, and then I would empower those people.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to find that it spreads very quickly. It spreads out and beyond. It's also worth noting, you mentioned bringing in the outside people, where I've been talking about the guys that were running the Kanema lab, Christian Anderson and Robert Gary. They are both co-authors on the proximal origin. We call it the proximal fraud paper that promoted the natural origin. It's kind of amazing because neither of those guys had any specialty in coronaviruses. It's so glaring. Like, why would you bring these people from the outside who are not coronavirus, especially Christian Anderson, not coronavirus specialists, and make them your point people in all of this? Well, they'd run the whole game before. And, I think what we both think on this is that Fauci helped them to do it, knew what had gone on all the time, and was like, hey, guys, I need a favor back. I got you out of this. Now I need you to run the same playbook here. It's also notable that Fauci rewarded all the people. Everybody who wrote Proximal Origin was rewarded with a large sequence of grants. We've done another story on that where we laid that out. The grants there was about $55 million in grants that was provided to a very small group of people, all of whom were part of supporting this natural origin narrative that Fauci so desperately needed to promote.
I wanted to come back to something you mentioned earlier, because I don't think it's widely appreciated enough. You remember how you raised the issue of the key? The original SARS virus didn't have the key to get into human cells. There's I'm just going to kind of explain this, try and keep it very brief, just to illustrate how ginormous the cover-up was and how obvious it is that this thing came out of the lab. Yeah. Here's the thing. Again, few people know this. It's been known for decades that this furin cleavage site is the key. That's what you need to get into human cells. You can go back and find studies from 20 years ago that talk about the furin cleavage site exactly for that purpose. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you can just, if you look for studies about the furin cleavage site, this has been a well-known thing for a very long time. In a highly simplified way, you're creating scissors that you're putting on the outside of the virus to go in and cut into the cell and get into the cell. So anyway, this has been known for a very long time. Now, as in something else that's been known for a very, very, very long time. There has never, ever in history been a beta coronavirus, which is the group of SARS. SARS viruses are part of that group. There's never been one, and they've sampled thousands. They have never, ever, ever found one with a furin cleavage site. So put those two things together. Experiments about furin cleavage sites and being able to be the key to enter the human body. Widely known, widely appreciated for many, many years. No SARS viruses with furin cleavage sites ever, anywhere, ever. And suddenly those two things come together. While you have a plan, a blueprint, the diffuse blueprint at the Wuhan lab for creating exactly that. I mean, even a
Let's also
5-year-old.
not forget about Ralph Baric and his humanized mice either, the godfather of gain of function, and his involvement in all of this, and it was the humanized mice that enabled them to create the furin cleavage site in the first place, that was meshing so well with humans, which is why it was so contagious and so virulent. So, we haven't mentioned, I don't think we've mentioned Baric to this point, but he's another element at North Carolina.
Well, 260, we had it at 263 million confirmed that he got from NIH. That's it's more than $250 million.
Yeah,
This guy.
a stagger. When we saw that number, it's like, oh my God, how? What is he doing with this?
Right. And we put out an article on that as well. So if you want to look at the details of that, we'll just go to truthovernews.org and there it is. It could be more because sometimes there's indirect funding. He's involved with some project that's also funded, whatever. But, as at a minimum, we're at $250 million for this guy alone. And of course, yeah, he's the one who empowered the Wuhan lab. Well, he gave them the humanized mice. So it's one thing to create these viruses with the scissors, with the furin cleavage site by adding that feature. It's another thing to then try it out. And that's what they do with these humanized mice, which mimic human cells. So then you feed the newly created virus into these mice, and then you see whether they get sick or not. And that I assume that's how the thing leaked out when they did the mice experiments. But again, without Baric, there wouldn't have been these mice experiments.
And it wasn't just the humanized mice; it was a whole-scale transfer of technology to the Wuhan lab in China, which is, for all intents and purposes, is identical to saying it was a transfer of technology to the Chinese Communist Party.
That's the other thing that Bhattacharya understands. This is also very, very important. We haven't even talked about that. He understands that China isn't just your run-of-the-mill normal country.
It's not a lab isolated in Wuhan.
Yeah, it's not just some privately run lab or some university lab or whatever. They have a Chinese Communist Party overseer. And by the way, Fauci's head scientist in the US, this guy called James LeDuc, he knew that. And he knew that he was the Communist Party head honcho at the lab because that's the guy he contacted, a guy called Yuan. He contacted right after COVID started. He was like, hey, what's up with your lab? And, we got to talk about lab leaks and where this virus came from. And then
going so far as to tell him now is the time to come clean.
He did. And that was right at the beginning. And of course, Yuan never responded. But I think the most telling part about that isn't even that sequence of emails. It's the fact that LeDuc knew, again, we know this from the emails as well. He knew that this is the Communist Party overseer of the lab. So of course, all these people knew that there was this connection. But maybe, I'm just trying to be charitable here. Maybe people who don't know China don't understand the extent of it. I mean, it is literally an organ of the Communist Party, maybe through a couple of extensions, maybe a bit further down the line, but still, there's that, you can still draw that direct connection. Again, Jay Bhattacharya understands that. This is very, very important, that he understands that if you're giving this technology to a lab in China, you're giving it to the Communist Party. There's no other way of putting it.
And he understands that Fauci understands that, and he understands that Peter Daszak understands that as well.
Right, exactly. And maybe I was being a bit too charitable, but I do think sometimes that people don't quite, appreciate the level of it. I mean, certainly among the media, I think honestly, some people really don't understand it. That they think that
there's basically no line between government and private sector in China.
Exactly. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is if you see a member of the media talking about Xi Zhengli, the director of the Wuhan lab, like, oh, we didn't have a leaky, that's what she said, and nothing to do with us, and so on. You can't take that at face value, even if for a moment we accept that she's not a bad person. And by the way, I have doubts about that, because she was the convener of the Communist Party 1,000 Talents program, which is a program. It's got a nice name, but what it is stealing Western technology. And she was in charge of that program at the Wuhan lab, she herself. So not such a good person. But let's just for argument's sake, she's a great person. You still can't trust a word she says because of the country she lives in. If she says something bad, then she's going to get into trouble. Her relatives, people are just, even if she were to kind of get out and seek asylum in another country, there's still that problem of having the people at home be persecuted. You can't escape that. I don't think people quite understand the nefariousness of the entire country and how it's run. Nothing is the way you assume it is if you have a normal country in mind. And anyway, I've heard or seen Jay Bhattacharya talk often enough about that to know that he is not under that illusion. So I think any future money that goes to China will either not go at all or will be very, very deeply scrutinized.
Yeah. By the way, it's not just us, saying that he's such a great pick, but I noticed none other than Richard Ebright responded multiple times to the announcement, saying how great a pick that he was and would be. So, I really, it's hard to understate, because there's so much more importance that's attached to this position than what many people realize. And I keep coming back to the fact that the way that it extends and permeates throughout the rest of the government, and the way that Fauci ran it, this position has the ability potentially to kind of unveil how our government is being run, and how our Defense Department is run, and how our intelligence community is run, and the way that they entangle themselves in so many different aspects, overlaid against the larger aspect that this was all being done in China, and everything that's involved in terms of being involved with the Communist Party of China and giving, really dangerous technology to the CCP. So, again, a huge position and probably the perfect candidate. I certainly, for myself, I know we'd both been pulling for him. I don't think there's anybody that I would, off the cuff, that I would have said that I'd rather have in his place. So maybe Richard Ebright, just because he'd be so angry at everybody. But
no, I completely agree. I couldn't think of anyone better than Jay Bhattacharya to run the NIH. And I maybe, as kind of a last thought here, as to why this is so important. In many ways, is maybe at least top 3 in terms of most important appointments.
Absolutely.
And arguably top for a very particular reason. And that is the threat that this stuff, the gain of function, these viruses, the engineered viruses, the genetic engineering of these pathogens poses to all of humanity. They did that with a SARS virus. SARS viruses are not particularly deadly. Yeah, they are, but not like super deadly. When they did the furin cleavage site, what if they'd done the furin cleavage site to a MERS virus? A MERS virus is 30% deadly. What if they'd done it to an even deadlier virus and it had escaped? Then you'd be talking about like a mass extinction event. And we're now at the point where,
what if they aerosolized Ebola?
Right. So, we're at the point where you can more or less do this in a kind of a random lab somewhere, if you have the right tools. It's been 80 years since nuclear weapons, right? You can't just like make a nuclear weapon in your living room. That's still a highly controlled. I mean, even the Iranians have been struggling for decades and decades to finally get it done. With Obama's help and so on. We'll talk about that another time. But in terms of these viruses, this is much, much easier in terms of getting it done. And it's much, much deadlier in terms of we saw what happened with COVID. And again, now imagine COVID being a highly deadly virus, and they do the same thing where it spreads like wildfire because they insert a furin cleavage site or do some other adjustment or manipulation of the virus to then, kill a whole bunch of people. to me personally, that's the biggest threat facing humanity, and it's not even close. And therefore, I think having Jay Bhattacharya in charge of these things is probably, if not the most important, certainly the top three most important, jobs in the United States right now.
In the NIH, we had an organization driven by Fauci that was aggressively pursuing gain of function. I mean, that's why they went to China, so that they could continue to do it. Fauci's written editorials why gain of function is valuable and that it's worth the risk taking, and it's not. It's absolutely not worth the risks. And so, that's actually ingrained probably throughout the entire culture of NIH. And now we have somebody coming in who understands the risks and the idea that, we're not getting any material benefits out of it, but we're taking on enormous, enormous risks. And hopefully he can address that.